It's Halloween night in the year 2000, and a Boeing 747 crawls onto the runway in Taiwan. The pilots struggle to see through their windshields in the face of howling winds and piercing rain. As they push their four massive engines to remove thrust, they have no idea that a terrifying surprise is waiting for them just ahead. This is the terrifying account of Singapore Airlines Flight 6. On October 31st, 2000, it was Halloween night in Taipei, and the weather was appropriate. Typhoon Zhangzhan was rapidly approaching, and its outer reaches had already begun to batter the airport. Winds gusting up to 100 kilometers per hour buffered the aircraft on the tarmac as heavy rain pelted the terminal. But, safely aboard a Boeing 747 operated by Singapore Airlines, 159 passengers from 20 different countries settled in for what was expected to be a routine overnight flight. Despite the diverse nationalities on board, the majority of the passengers were from the United States and Taiwan. 77 of them had boarded the plane hours earlier in Singapore, while the remaining 82 had just arrived in Taipei, along with the flight crew. The flight crew consisted of 3 well-rested pilots who had arrived in Taipei 24 hours earlier. Feng Qikong, the captain, was a Malaysian national with over 11,000 flying hours at the age of 41. He had been repeatedly assessed by the airline as an above-average pilot, with colleagues describing him as one of Singapore Airlines' best pilots. He had also been described as a friendly and approachable duty officer. The only blemish on his record was a 13-year-old noisy departure from Zurich, Switzerland, which resulted in a letter from the airline asking him to adhere more strictly to the noise abatement procedure there. It's not the worst of crimes, but with the wind howling like it did that night, noise shouldn't be an issue. The first officer was 36-year-old Singaporean Latif Sarano. Sarano had significantly less experience than the captain, with only about 2,500 hours of total flying time, 500 of which operate the 747. Colleagues described him as above average, disciplined, and willing to speak up if he noticed safety issues on the flight. An additional first officer sat behind the captain and first officer. Un Kong Ling, a 38-year-old Singaporean, would serve as a relief pilot on this trip, taking over from the first officer over the Pacific. He had no specific responsibilities up until this point, other than to keep an eye on what the pilots were doing. He was described as mature and disciplined, with strong flying abilities and the potential to become a captain in due course. It's worth noting here that Singapore Airlines has an excellent safety record. It had well-trained crews, a fleet of cutting-edge aircraft, and no fatalities in its 28-year history. So, when the plane pushed back from Taipei's Gate B5 at 5:11 p.m. local time, the 159 passengers had little cause for concern. They had no idea that, far from embarking on a 12-hour flight, their aircraft would never leave the ground. Consider the following scenario. It is late at night, the weather is bad, and things are only getting worse as a typhoon approaches. The pilots have a straightforward load of passengers eager to reach their destination. If you've seen a few of my videos, you'll have a good idea of what's coming up. Under time constraints and the need to get airborne before the storm hits, the pilots begin to make mistakes. However, this is not the story that is about to unfold. The captain immediately set the opposite tone in the cockpit. What's strange about what's about to happen is the stark contrast between the pilots' level of caution and the terrifying situation they'll soon find themselves in. As the most experienced member of the flight crew, the captain chose to taxi the aircraft to the runway. He would handle the takeoff and landing out of Taipei. As he taxied out, he emphasized the importance of taking things slowly and methodically. The first officer's job as the plane rolled slowly out to the runway was to go through the checklists and assist the captain in preparing the aircraft for takeoff. He adjusted the flaps to 20 degrees, and the captain confirmed the takeoff speeds. The plane would lift off the runway at 156 knots, or approximately 290 kilometers per hour. To put this speed in perspective, the wind on this night was ghosting at 1/3 of the plane's takeoff speed, or about 100 kilometers per hour. As the two pilots went about their duties, the relief pilot listened to the ATIS, which stands for Automatic Terminal Information Service. This is the service provided at all major airports, and pilots can use it to find out the latest weather conditions at the airport. It was a daunting weather report, almost too much to take in. There was less than 500 meters of visibility, and the winds gusted to nearly 100 kilometers per hour, rocking the plane as it slowly made its way through the darkness. Some of the passengers were becoming nervous. If these were the conditions on the ground, how would they be in the air? But in the cockpit, everything was under control. The captain's attitude was clear. Currently, the winds and visibility were within safe limits for takeoff. If the conditions remained unchanged, the plane would depart. If they worsened, the plane would simply turn around and return to the gate. There's no rush or pressure. The airport airlines have an excellent safety record. If you want to know what's going to happen, look at this chart. This is an exact copy of the charts used by the pilots that night. When air traffic control instructed the pilots to taxi, they followed this route. Along the Sierras, up the West Cross, left, down November Papa, and then up this way for takeoff. I'm on runway 05, left. When air traffic control gave the pilots their taxi route, the captain reviewed it with the other two pilots in the cockpit to ensure that everyone was on the same page. While the route was straightforward, the pilots had to exercise a little more caution than usual. It had been over 3 years since anyone had taken off from this runway. They were more familiar with runway 06, located at the airport's south end. As Flight 06 approached the West Cross, the captain confirmed with his colleagues that this was the turn he needed to make. And, once this was confirmed, he began slowly turning the aircraft to the right with the tiller. He stated that he would proceed at a slow speed to avoid skidding the aircraft during the turn. He didn't want to skid his $200 million plane into the mud. From his position behind the pilots, the relief pilot had a clear view of both their primary flight displays. He could see that the winds were so strong that they were detected by the pitot tubes on the plane's fuselage and displayed as changes in airspeed on the pilot's airspeed tapes. With the wind hitting the aircraft from the right side, the captain's and first officer's instruments showed different airspeed readings. It was more of a peculiarity than anything else, indicating the sheer force of the wind that night. As the pilots peered out their windscreens through the rain, they received some good news on the radio. The runway visual range, or the distance pilots can see down the runway, has increased from 200 meters to 450 meters. At the moment, conditions were improving. When they arrived at the runway, it appeared that they would be taking off after all. Nonetheless, the captain continued taxiing slowly at approximately 9 knots, or 17 kilometers per hour. In a matter of minutes, they would arrive at the runway. While it appeared that the weather would hold out long enough for them to leave, another issue arose. What if they took off but then needed to return to the airport, only to find it closed due to bad weather after they left? They had previously agreed that if this occurred, they could travel to Hong Kong or Kaohsiung instead. However, both of these were now closed as the typhoon moved north. With the storm closing in, their only option was Taipei. The pilots hoped it would remain a viable option as they approached the runway. Despite the circumstances, the pilots remained calm and methodical as they discussed the situation. There was no sense of urgency or pressure. After a few minutes, the plane reached the end of the Western Cross. Looking at his taxi chart, the first officer confirmed with the captain that he needed to turn left onto the November Papa taxiway and proceed to the end. Once there, they'd be on the runway. The captain turned the tiller counterclockwise, and the 747 lumbered left onto the taxiway, November Papa. Let's take a look at the chart the pilots were using that night. At the time, Taipei's airport was undergoing significant changes. Currently, runway 05 is being converted into a taxiway. The reason for this was that it was too short and narrow to be useful anymore, given the sheer size of many of the aircraft that now fly into the airport. It would have been much more useful as a taxiway parallel to runway 05 left, the airport's longest runway. We'll see why this is so significant in a moment. If you've ever looked out the window of a plane at an airport, you'll recognize all of the different colored lights. These include green taxiway centerline lights, blue edge lights, white runway lights, and red approach lights. The color and position of these lights are completely intentional, and they are consistent around the world. There are also runway-specific markings, such as these white stripes here, known as piano keys, that indicate the beginning of a runway. But what do airports do when they convert a runway into a taxiway? You are supposed to change all of the markings and lighting so that they are appropriate for a taxiway. But in Taipei, this had not happened. So, on Halloween night in the year 2000, as the pilots of Singapore Airlines Flight 6 approached the end of taxiway November Papa, they began to succumb to a series of psychological and systemic errors that would put them in danger. It began at 15 minutes past 11 when the tower controller cleared Flight 6 to line up on the runway. The first officer instructed the cabin crew to take their seats for takeoff and began reading out the pre-takeoff checklist. The captain had his head down on the checklist, peering through the blackness at the windscreen, carefully following the green lights that beckoned him onto the runway. He reminded his colleagues that he would move slowly as he turned. White piano keys would be slippery. The controller couldn't see the aircraft through the heavy rain, and he didn't have ground radar to determine its location. If he had, he would have noticed that Flight 6 was not lining up on runway 05 left, as he had instructed, but on runway 05 right. The captain was following the green taxiway lights, which were much closer together in the turn than on the straight path up to runway 05 left. There were only 4 lights along the 200-meter-long taxiway connecting runway 05 right and left. Legally, there should have been 16 lights, but one of those 4 wasn't working and another was unacceptably dim. In other words, as the captain followed the green lights curving onto runway 05 right, he had little indication that another runway lay to his left in the darkness. As the plane approached, the first officer noticed that the PVD had not been uncluttered. The PVD, also known as a power visual display, is a one-of-a-kind device installed on some aircraft's glare shield that provides pilots with a visual indication of whether they are drifting off the runway center line during low-visibility takeoffs. Most of the time, it had a shutter in front of it, but when the aircraft detected that it was approaching the runway, it unshuttered, revealing the barber pole, similar to PVD. It struck the pilots as odd that this remained closed after they had lined up on the runway. Of course, the reason was that they had set their navigation radios to the frequency of the runway where they were supposed to line up, runway 05 left. They were now more than 200 meters from the runway, sitting comfortably on what was now a taxiway. Furthermore, the pilots knew that runway 05 right was being converted into a taxiway. But in the dark, drawn in by the green lights, they never questioned whether they were in the right place. Furthermore, as they sat poised on the threshold, bright green centerline lights stretched into the darkness. The fact that these lights were green rather than white, as is customary for runway lights, should have alerted the pilots that they were on a taxiway, not a runway. They had already decided that this was the right place. Furthermore, the runway had always had green lights because it was originally a taxiway. Ironically, if visibility had been lower, the pilots would have been safer. They had to use the power visual display to take off when the visibility was less than 50 meters. But on this night, they could see 500 meters ahead of them. That's why, as they lined up, the captain told his crew that the PVD was irrelevant because they could still see the runway. So, at 16 minutes past 11, the captain activated the windshield wipers on high, turned on the landing lights, and pushed the engines to take off thrust. The engines roared, and the massive aircraft began to accelerate down the runway into darkness. The 159 passengers were well on their way to Los Angeles. Within a few seconds, Flight 6 was accelerating at 80 knots, or about 150 kilometers per hour. The pilots peered through the void ahead of them as more runway became visible through the fog. However, just as they were about to reach takeoff speed, the terrible truth emerged from the darkness. Bulldozers, excavators, 2 rollers, and rows of concrete barriers were parked directly in the middle of the runway, illuminated by the aircraft's powerful lights. The captain called out, but it was too late. The 747 smashed through the concrete barricades and tore through the construction vehicles while traveling at 150 knots, 280 kilometers per hour. A portion of the left wing, as well as 3 of the aircraft's engines, were ripped off, causing the plane to swerve left. The fuel tanks ruptured, and a massive firewall ignited, engulfing the plane, which split into 3 pieces and began tumbling down the runway. Everything was over in a matter of seconds. The tower controllers noticed the massive fireball tearing through the darkness and immediately dispatched the airport's fire service. More than 400 responders rushed to the scene. They arrived within 3 minutes, but for anyone on board, it was already too late. These photos, taken the day after the accident, demonstrate the extent of the devastation. Only 96 of the 179 people on board survived, including 3 pilots. It was Singapore Airlines' first and only fatal accident and the first to involve a Boeing 747-400. However, everyone had the same question in mind. How could an experienced crew make such a simple mistake? The sheer senselessness of the mistake became even more apparent in the light of day, with the correct runway visible next to the crashed aircraft. This was precisely what investigators focused on when they began their investigation immediately following the crash. They discovered that the pilots were misled by the runway lighting, particularly given that their home base was Singapore, where controllers changed the color of the taxiway lighting in front of the pilots to direct them to the runway, instructing them to follow the green. So, on Flight 6, despite the pilots' warnings about the weather, they reverted to their usual routine of simply following the green lighting to the runway. It didn't help that the closed runway still had runway markings and bright centerline lights, despite not being used. All of this meant that when the pilots turned onto the runway, they subconsciously ignored all of the information indicating that they were not where they should be. Unshotted PVD, off-center ILS deviation scale, and green centerline lighting. They fell victim to the same psychological bias that has claimed so many lives in aviation over the years. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirming one's existing beliefs. In this case, the pilots had just enough information to believe they were in the right place, so they ignored all evidence to the contrary. But how can we improve aviation safety when it is susceptible to such fundamental flaws in human cognition? As a result of this accident, many modern aircraft, including the newest generation Boeing 747, the Airbus A350, and the Boeing 787, among others, have moving map displays inside the cockpit, allowing pilots to see their position in real time as they move through the airport rather than relying on paper maps and charts. This technology alone could have prevented the crash of Flight 6. Pilots are now receiving more training in what is known as threat and error management, which requires them to take note of the dangers and potential mistakes they may make as they taxi out to the runway. If the pilots on Flight 6 had discussed the possibility of mistaking runway 0.5 right for 0.5 left, the accident could have been avoided. In addition, airports must now comply with more stringent signage and lighting regulations. These layers of protection, which cover everything from human factors to avionics, have significantly reduced the likelihood of an accident like this. However, the crash of Singapore Airlines Flight 6 demonstrates how unforgiving aviation can be, especially